World of Warcraft is one of my favorite games. It's so big, it's so immersive. There was such a great community at different parts of the game, and overall, it's got a good story and it has a lot of great mechanics. But it does have a lot of downsides, especially nowadays. And so today I'm going to talk about World of Warcraft, and it's a lot different to how it used to feel, and I definitely like the game in its earlier stages. And I'm not trying to turn this video into a huge nostalgia thing where I'm gonna just say everything old was better, because that's not always true. There's a lot of ways the game is objectively smoother and more convenient now, but at the same time, it feels like something about the overall experience has shifted a lot, and in a way that's hard to describe unless you've spent a ton of time in it. If you think back to earlier versions of the game, or even just the general idea people have of it, there was a much stronger sense that you were existing in a world rather than moving through just like a system. And that difference sounds small, but it really changes how you approach everything. Because back then, a lot of the friction in the game was just accepted as part of the experience. Traveling took time, finding groups took effort, and even simple things like completing quests could take much longer than expected. But all of that contributed to this feeling that what you were doing mattered in some way, and it really gave you a sense of accomplishment, especially if you got a reward at the end for it. It really was nice getting that upgrade that you worked so hard for. And now, a lot of the friction has been reduced, which for some players could be a good thing, because it makes the game more accessible and less time consuming, but it also changes how connected you feel to what you're doing. Because when everything is streamlined, it starts to feel more like you're moving from one objective to the next rather than living in the space between them. And you notice this a lot in how players interact with each other, because in earlier versions, you often had to rely on other people much more directly, whether it was for the dungeons, the elite quests, or just figuring things out, and that naturally led to more random interactions, even if they were small. Whereas now, a lot of those systems are automated or simplified. You could just go through large parts of the game without really needing to talk to anyone anymore. And again, it's convenient, but it also makes the world feel a lot quieter and a lot different. And I think a big part of this comes from how the game has evolved to fit modern expectations, because players generally want things to be faster and more efficient, and the developers have responded to that over time in certain ways. So you end up with a version of the game that respects your time more, I suppose, but also doesn't slow you down enough to create those same kinds of moments that you used to feel. And the pacing of progression is another thing that stands out a lot, because leveling up used to feel like a much bigger part of the game, where reaching level cap was an accomplishment in itself, and it was something that there was a journey to. There was something you spent time, a lot of time to. But now leveling is often seen as something you just get through on the way to get to the real content. You hit max level and then you're like, now I can really start playing the game. And that really shifts your mindset. Instead of enjoying the process, character progression, one of the biggest parts of the MMORPG, getting your character stronger over time, you're much more focused on just reaching the end game as quickly as possible. And once you're there, the structure of the game becomes very clear, with things like dungeons, raids, daily and weekly objectives that are designed to keep you engaged. There's nothing inherently wrong with that exactly, but it does make the experience feel a lot more structured and less open-ended. And earlier I mentioned that the game does respect your time more, but I bet there could be an argument made that these daily and weekly objectives, these chores basically, can actually be quite disrespectful to the player's time. This structure can sometimes make the game also feel really repetitive, not because there isn't variety, but because the way you interact with that variety is a lot more predictable. You log in, you know what you're gonna do, and you go through that loop. And some people, after they do that, they just log out. It's like their daily chores and then they leave. Does that really sound like a game? And for some players, that's actually a good thing, because it gives them a clear sense of direction. But for others, including myself, it can feel like the game has lost a lot of its unpredictability, where you didn't always know exactly how your session was going to go or exactly what you're going to do. You just went along with the journey. And another thing that's changed over time is how much information is available to players, because early on, a lot of things had to be discovered through trial and error or shared through smaller communities, forums. YouTube was barely a thing. Whereas now everything is documented, it's optimized, it's easily accessible. So instead of experimenting or figuring things out as you go, you're often just following these paths, these established guides, whether that's for leveling, gearing, playing your class efficiently, boss fights. A lot of the endgame content has this issue, especially with the add-ons that basically tell you everything and have everything figured out for you in the most optimal way. And that can make the game kind of feel really solved, if you know what I mean. There's no mystery, there's nothing to figure out. And it takes away a lot of the depth. Now, that doesn't mean there's no depth, but because there still is a lot of depth. But especially at higher levels of play, there can be a good bit of depth. But the way players engage with that depth has changed, because it's less about discovery and more about execution. And the social aspect really ties into this. This is probably some of people's biggest complaint, because when everyone has access to the same information and is working towards similar goals, interactions become a lot more transactional, like joining a group, completing an objective, and then moving on without much conversation, rather than making friends and seeing people and remembering people through the game world. And of course, that's not always the case. There's still communities and guilds that can create pretty strong social experiences, but it's not as naturally built into the gameplay as it used to be, and you have to seek it out a lot more. And I think all of this contributes to a feeling that the game is more efficient, but also a lot more contained. Everything works well, everything's polished, but it doesn't always leave as much room for those unplanned moments that made the world feel bigger and a lot more interesting. And at the same time, it's important to recognize that some of these changes could have been necessary because the player base changed over time, expectations changed, and the game has to compete a lot more now than it did when it first came out. So it's not really a simple case of the game getting worse. It's more like something that basically become something slightly different, shaped by years of updates, design decisions, and player behavior. And depending on what you value in a game, that shift can either feel like an improvement or a loss, or a bit of both at the same time. And that's why conversations about World of Warcraft tend to go in circles, because people are often talking about different versions of the experience, even if they're technically playing the same game. And it's definitely one of the most influential games ever made, and still a pretty big game to this day, and it still does a lot of things pretty well, such as art, voice acting, there's a bunch of things. But it also feels like it's carrying the weight of everything it's been over the years, which makes it harder for it to feel as simple or as focused as it once did. And I think that's really what it comes down to. Not that the game is worse or better in a clear way, but that it feels different in a way that's hard to ignore once you've noticed it, especially if you've been around long enough to see how it's changed. One thing I'm thinking of right now that's hard to ignore is how many different systems are layered on top of each other now. And not even in a confusing way necessarily, because most of them are explained pretty clearly, but there's just a lot to keep track of at any given time, whether it's gear progression, currencies, upgrade paths, weekly limits, reputation tracks, or whatever the current expansion is adding on top of that. And when you first log in, it can feel like you're checking in on a bunch of different things at once, almost like you're maintaining progress across multiple tracks instead of just focusing on a clear goal. And that changes how you think about your time in the game, because you're not just asking, what do I feel like doing? But you're also thinking, what should I be doing so I don't fall behind on all this stuff? It's almost like a list of chores. And that falling behind feeling is kind of a big part of it, because even if the game doesn't force you to do everything, it definitely encourages you to stay on top of certain things regularly, especially if you care about staying competitive or keeping your character up to date. And that creates this low pressure where logging in isn't always just about playing, it's sometimes just about keeping up. And again, that's not unique to this game, and a lot of long-running games do this, and World of Warcraft has kind of always been this way. But it's very noticeable here because there's so many overlapping systems at the moment in the current way the game works now. Another thing that ties into this is how the rewards are structured, because a lot of them are tied to specific activities that reset on a timer, like daily or weekly content. And that kind of design makes sense because it keeps players coming back, but it also turns in the game as something that you engage with in cycles rather than just freely and kind of playing it at your own pace. So instead of playing whenever you feel like it and doing whatever you want, you might find yourself logging in at certain times to make sure you're hitting those resets, which again makes the experience feel a lot more scheduled than it used to. And even when you're not actively thinking about it, that structure kind of sits in the background and influences how you play, because certain things are more worth it at certain times, and that subtly guides your decisions. Albeit for some, it's probably not so subtle. And then there's the whole idea of optimization, which has become a much bigger part of the game over time, like I said before, not just at the highest level, but across a lot of the player base, where people are more aware of what the best choices are in terms of build, gear, strategies, and so on. And like I was saying before, it's just because the information is so easy to find now. It's so common for players to follow these paths rather than experimenting, and instead of seeing a wide range of different playstyles, you often see very small variations of the same few effective methods, because those are the ones that are very proven to work and do the best numbers and the best whatever. And this also affects how groups are formed and how players are evaluated, because when there's a clear idea of what's optimal, it becomes easier to judge whether someone is meeting that standard, which can make group content feel a lot more selective or performance focused. And I don't know, I think it just kind of hurts the community part and the idea of being social and making friends. That's not always a bad thing, and also that kind of has been a part of the game for a very long time, especially for players who enjoy really pushing the difficult content, but it does change the social dynamic compared to a time when things were a little bit less defined and people were more willing to figure out things together and work together. Even outside of high-end content, you can kind of feel that shift, because there's this general expectation that players should know what they're doing even in more casual settings, and that can make the game feel less forgiving in certain situations. And at the same time, the game is also more solo friendly than it used to be. It's pretty much a single player game in so many different ways, which is a huge complaint people have, which is kind of an interesting contrast, because you can do a lot on your own without needing a group, but when you do step into group content, the expectations feel really high. So you end up with this mix where the game supports solo play a little too well, but also has these pockets where coordination and performance matter a ton, and moving between those two modes can feel a bit uneven depending on what you're doing. And I think all of this contributes to the idea that the game has become more about managing systems and meeting expectations than just exploring and interacting with the world in a loose way. And again, doesn't mean it's worse, it just means it asks something different from the player, especially from a player base that maybe doesn't like that. Because instead of just investing time and seeing what happens, you're often making decisions about how to spend that time the most effectively, and that mindset changes the game and how it feels, even if the core gameplay is still pretty recognizable. And for some people, that added structure and depth is exactly what they want, because it gives them clear goals and a sense of progression across multiple layers. But for others, it can feel a bit overwhelming or even a little tiring, especially if they're not trying to engage with everything at once. That's kind of where the divide comes from, because the game is trying to support a lot of different playstyles at the same time, and in doing that, it ends up being very flexible, but also a bit dense in how it presents everything. And so when people talk about the game feeling different, I think part of it is this shift toward complexity and system management, where there's always something to track, something to optimize, or something to keep up with. But then on the other hand, the game is super easy in certain points, and you can pretty much just make this massively multiplayer online game a single player game. And that changes the overall experience, even if each individual system is well designed on its own. And you could argue that some of those systems are not well designed at all. And you can still log in and wander around and do something simple if you want to, but the game as a whole feels like it's built around a much more structured and layered approach. Whether that feels engaging or exhausting really depends on how you prefer to play. I will say myself that I did end up quitting this game a few years back. It was around the Shadowlands expansion. The lore just got super screwy. There was way too much stuff going on, way too many daily things going on, and too many grinds and all this stuff. And I know it's crazy to say there's too many grinds for this kind of game, but it was just ridiculous. There was so many different things you had to do and keep up with, and so many different daily and weekly things, and overall it was just a mess, and the lore was actually horrific, and they really ruined and retconned way too many things. So overall, I ended up quitting after that. I started playing around late Wrath of the Lich King, and I had to quit around about midway through Shadowlands just because of how awful it was getting. So personally, not a huge fan of the game anymore, but I really did like it for a long time, and the Legion expansion was amazing. All this stuff was amazing. I can definitely make more future videos about this because there's a lot to say about it. But overall, I just wanted to talk about the game as a whole and kind of why I think this shift has occurred. But that's pretty much all I have to say, so let me know what you guys are thinking about it.